I'm going to move on now to our first panel discussion. So let me do some introductions here. So give me a second. I've got my paperwork all ready to go. Our first panelist has received his master's degree in economics from the University of Michigan. Primary research interests are in labor economics and economic forecasting. For more than 30 years, been engaged in economic forecasting for the state and local governments, frequently called upon for policy advice. He's worked for many years with the Michigan Departments of Transportation, Treasury, Michigan Economic Development Corporation on policy analysis and evaluating economic strategies. Welcome, everybody. Don Grimes, who is the Regional Economic Specialist at the University of Michigan. Up next is our next guest is a Muskegon native, served the State Association of Home Builders, the Home Builders Association of Michigan, for 16 years now. He has 36 years of government policy experience in both Washington, D.C. and Lansing. Earlier in his career, he was a legislative aide to the late Grand Rapids area Congressman Paul Henley. And upon returning to Michigan, he served as a policy advisor to Governor John Engler, appointed by the governor as president of the Michigan Strategic Fund, became part of the original executive leadership group that created the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. Welcome, Bob Filka. Bob, thank you very much. Next is the Senior Vice President of Community Development Banking, Michigan Market Manager at PNC Bank. He manages a team of community development bankers across 3 regions in the state of Michigan, focused on leveraging PNC Bank's human and financial resources to address community needs, providing banking opportunities for all through a diversified product set and outstanding customer service through a high-performance team. This is Bryan Kieler. Bryan, welcome. And finally, the representative, no, okay. All right, so there'll be the 3 of us, as engaging as we are. Let's see here. I want to make doubly sure I got everybody. Kieler, right, okay. Yep, just make sure I got it. Okay. So, gentlemen, let's have a few discussions. As the business editor at Channel 4, I have the pleasure of being in touch with a lot of different people who send me things. And I received a couple of studies and some thoughts, so I thought I'd just share them and then give us a little perspective so we can sort of get started. And the first thing that we have is it was a bank rate study that was done. I think it was about 1,500 people. And this was done the last month, but it talks about home ownership still being a paramount part of the American dream. 74% of Americans cited owning a home as important to them, which, strangely enough, outpaces being able to retire, which was only 62%, having a successful career, 61%, owning a car, truck, or automobile, 52%, having children, 42%, or getting a college degree, 33%. A lot of this stuff may not be news to anybody, but I thought it gives us perspective. Affordability issues are a major hurdle, obviously, to home ownership. 73% of the aspiring homeowners cite affordability factors as the obstacles holding them back, including not having enough income, 46%, home prices being too high, 42%, or the inability to afford a down payment and closing costs, which is 40%. And I'm surprised it's only 40% because the down payment's really the big issue. Many are willing to make sacrifices to find more affordable housing. 64% of Americans are willing to make sacrifices to find more affordable housing, such as downsizing living space, moving out of state, buying a fixer-upper, moving farther from friends and family, taking on roommates, living with additional family members, moving farther away, moving to a less desirable area or something else. And while owning a home is the most cited element to the American dream, the sentiment is stronger among baby boomers, obviously, 59 to 77, Gen Xers, 43 to 58, 84% and 76% respectively. Younger millennials, 27 to 33, and Gen Z are more likely to cite having a successful career than owning a home. So that's just a couple of things that I picked up. But this I thought was very interesting because I didn't know this, and it really gives perspective. The most affordable housing markets in America, and this is done by Wallet Hub, Detroit is 4th. They're saying that the housing affordability is 4th, and then they have a number of differing things that Detroit rates with. But here's the list of the Michigan cities that come in on the list of the most affordable housing markets in America. Number 2 is Flint. Number 4 is Detroit. Number 6 is Warren. Number 13 is Grand Rapids. 24 is Livonia. 27 is Dearborn. 49 is Lansing. 119 is Sterling Heights. And Ann Arbor is 146. So as we sit here today, and I looked to see if Pontiac made the list, and apparently it's not large enough to make that list. But the point is that we live in what is thought of as the most affordable housing area, and if you dot those dots, it encircles Pontiac. And so if we're having difficulty, I don't even want to think about what it's like in, say, California, which is considered the most expensive housing and most difficult to afford. So if, in fact, we live in that area where it's the most affordable in the country, I guess the best question would be, okay, where do we begin? In other words, is that good news or is that bad news? Gentlemen, take it away. Let me hear what you have to say.
So, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. So, I may take a little contrary view that there's a problem with home ownership, affordability. First, in Oakland County, 73% of the households live in owner-occupied homes, and 27% of households are renters. Of that 73%, that own their home, 2/3 have a mortgage, and 1/3 of the people, or about 1/4 of all households in Oakland County, live in a home mortgage-free. And last thing I want to point out is for everybody who is in an owner-occupied home, prices go up. That's a good thing. Home prices go up, they're wealthier. As we saw in 2007 and 2008, a real problem occurs when the value of owner-occupied homes goes down. So I really don't want to, I'm not really worried about the people who are living in their home, who are owner-occupied homes. In our county, in our state, in our country, those people will be fine. I'm a little concerned about people who want to try to get into these homes, but I'd encourage them to do it because it becomes a great investment and, as you said, makes for the American dream. But what I want to focus on when we think about affordable housing are renters. All right. First is we have seen a tremendous increase in cost of rental homes relative to the Consumer Price Index. From 2010 to 2021, and I'm using 21 because I'm going to talk about some other data that ends, that's the last data period. Overall Consumer Price Index increased by 21%. The cost of renting a home increased by 39%. So it's gotten much more expensive to rent a home. Cost for homeowners went up by 31%. So they also lost ground, in terms of paying for their home, but they get the appreciation and they get richer over time. So 40% increase roughly in the price of cost of renting a home, compared to an overall increase of 21%. It's gotten more expensive. The median income for somebody who's living in an owner-occupied home in Oakland County is $104,000. Median income for a renter in Oakland County is $51,500. So there's a huge gap in the income of renters versus owners. In Oakland County, everybody is relatively affluent because in the U.S., it's a little over $40,000, the median income of renters. So we're still affluent. Our rent's expensive. 27% of the population in Oakland County. But here's where it gets really and concerns me. If you look at households with an income of $35,000 a year or less, 80% of those households in Oakland County are spending more than 35% on rent. That's sort of a guideline of what people should be spending for households, not to be completely stressed out. And probably half of those households are spending 50% or more on rent. That's about 48,000 households with an income of less than $35,000. Only 20% of them are spending less than 35% on rent. That means 39,000 households who are renters in Oakland County with an income of less than $35,000 are spending more than 35% of their income on rent. What we have a shortage of is low-cost housing for low-cost, low-income families. We need, by my estimate, somewhere around 39,000 more housing units and rental housing units in Oakland County where the rent is $600, $700, $800, $900, less than $1,000 a month. I have no idea how we're going to find that sort of housing given the cost structure to build, to finance the housing. Statewide, the state of Michigan needs 400, maybe 500,000 rental housing units that rent for $600, $700, $800, $900 a month. It's an enormous problem in scale, even though it really only focuses on a small share of our total population, but the crisis for these people is enormous. And so Pontiac Public Housing Commission and everybody else who's trying to help out find a way for affordable housing, really, I hope to keep the focus on lower income households in rental units, because it's not like if they can no longer afford their housing, they become homeless. It's not like they have to downscale, they become homeless. So that's where I want to try to get the focus as best I can, and how we can create huge numbers of lower cost housing units.
Bob and Bryan, then maybe the question is this, I always look at it as sort of, okay, what is the market telling us in this situation? In other words, is it market driven that the prices are up? Is it market driven that we can't afford to build these houses? I mean, where are we in that?
I think the answer is yes on your questions. If you look historically, and I think in order to find solutions, I think you have to look backwards, right? You have to look at what has happened over the last 14, 15 years. We lost 60,000 people in our industry who worked in housing back in the last housing crash. We, on average, a state our size, and Don can correct me if I'm wrong, we should be building between 25 and maybe 30,000 homes a year just to keep up with normal aging housing stock and demographic shifts. We haven't built that many homes in like 15 years. After the housing crash, we dropped to 4,000 or 5,000 homes a year. We've climbed now to maybe 16,000 or 17,000 single-family homes being built across the state now. So we're still short. And I heard the MISHDA director speak a couple weeks ago saying, and I agree with this number, we're about 190,000 single-family units short in our state. And if you do the math over the last 14 or 15 years, that math makes sense. But what exacerbates that problem even more is the homes that have been built for the last 14 or 15 years have all been at the high end of the market. Nobody's been building in that starter home category. Now, I'm saying that at a high level because obviously you have pockets of that kind of development around the state, but very limited. So the vast majority of homes, very high end of the market. And the point I want to make is the housing ecosystem is connected all the way through, right? As you're building fewer homes in that missing middle area and there's not enough homes even being built at the high end, people start looking down that housing ecosystem. Shoot, I'm a prime example of that myself. I'm an empty nester, right? Downsized from a big, huge house, was thinking I would build new, worked for a lot of builders, know a lot of builders that could build me a nice house, but then started looking at the price of that new construction versus what I could get in the existing market and renovate. So I ended up buying a home that's 50 years old and putting money into it. That historically, that house would be purchased by probably a first-time home buyer. And so you see, and then that trickles all the way down into the rental situation that Don points to. So, our problem really, in my view, while I appreciate Don's point that, hey, we need more rental units, I would say we also need more housing stock right in that middle, because if your only option is rent at escalating prices or purchase at super high prices, single-family homes, you're not going to get there quick enough. We're going to lose a whole generation of people building equity and wealth. And so, from my perspective, it's really ultimately, in terms of solutions, it's all about the math, right? How do you as a community help make the math work for a builder and developer to actually be able to make money to build homes in that starter price point range or multifamily? You've got to make the math work. And I know you have a great panel this afternoon of some people who are doing some of those things, using tools. Actually, many economic development tools are now being flipped on their head and being used to attract housing investment. And that's how communities have to start thinking about getting the housing investment they need. You need to look at how you can attract that investment, because there's limited production capacity in our state. I mentioned that we lost 60,000 people in the industry back in the last housing crash. We haven't replaced all those people. And anybody trying to build a house now or even get work done on their house, it's taking months and years, right? So you're competing against the rest of the state and trying to attract that housing investment. Come up with the best creative solutions to try and attract that investment for your community to help make that math work, so they'll invest in that kind of housing stock. So giving kind of a long answer to your question, but I think we have to look backwards in order to move forward.
And so essentially we've not recovered from the last crash. No. And so then it begs the question, so we've warped the market, right? And so it's doing all kinds of things. It's acting the way it's supposed to, but it's not working in a fashion that, one, that we're used to, or two, that we want. And so how do we fix that, making math work? Bryan, tell me about what you do, or what you think needs to get done in an environment where there aren't major tracts of land in a lot of places anymore. Are we going back, and is it doable to take existing housing stock and make it into lower cost housing?
So the easy question. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to blend a little bit of both. I'm a reform banker, so I'm a community development person first. I just happen to work at a bank, but I also work in academia and teaching at some colleges inside of community development as well. And so I think when I look at this, blending this ideology, a couple of things is, one, yeah, we have a lot of affordable housing options, but we don't have quality affordable housing, right? So that in itself, I mean, a lot of you are really housing that we wouldn't want to live in, or we wouldn't expect the average person to live in. And so how do we blend that piece together? And I think when we look at the development cost, the element of, one, the average state household income is about $89,000 a year, and Pontiac is $36,000. So this ideology of building more communities of just subsidized affordable housing, it doesn't work, and it's not sustainable in the sense of, because people who don't have discretionary income can't support the local restaurants and the local mom and pop shops that creates jobs in the community. So we see this element of, one, a lack of skilled labor, a rise of construction costs, inflationary times. So you even take away the option, well, I'll just live further away, because if I have lack of disposable income, I can't pay $3, $4 of gas and spend that much in gas fuel too. So it gets really challenging to say, how do we solve this?
And
right?
and it begs the question too, when you've got a help wanted sign on virtually every business from here to Tulsa, that only exacerbates it, does it not?
It definitely can. And so when we look at, like, how do we solve this challenge, I think one is, Richard Rothstein wrote a great book, The Color of Law. And it talked about our federal policies back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that really segregated America. And we're really seeing the challenges of this. We're seeing the disinvestment of our urban cores, and we're seeing the worst of it come out now. And so now we have to figure out as a society, are we really trying to fix this? And so there's ways. I think we have once-in-a-lifetime opportunity with ARPA dollars coming in that the mayor talked about. We have ways of creative financing in the banking world. We're improving our down payment assistance program to try to create that opportunity where affordable housing or housing options are attainable. But I also do think, for example, if we go on a micro example, we look at Pontiac, we have to have housing options, right? And I'm not saying what's the right approach per se. And so one of the things that, and I said a couple of tables with the Mayor's Advisory Council, the Committee of 50th, Pastor Jones, Oakland University's group, and the Pontiac Funder Collaborative in this conversation, but we're asking for a master plan to say, where should the city go and to preserve affordable housing? And the easiest way to make developers build there and to build affordable too, create policy that every new housing option has to have 20%, 30% affordable, figure out the market rate. Let the top end market do it, but as soon as we do that, we preserve places for people to live. We try to avoid gentrification challenges, because we've seen way too many times in our country where we have so much patient capital on the sidelines. For example, even in the 70s when Pittsburgh rebuilt from the steel industry, they displaced a lot of people because they didn't put policy to preserve the more vulnerable population. So banks have their programs of what we're doing, but I think a lot of it is through collaboration. I see many great community partners in the room too. We can't do it on our own, right? And even banks no longer can say inside of our four walls, here's the tools we have and that's all we have. We have to come outside of our box and we have to lean in with our partners, if it's the foundations, municipalities, community nonprofits that are doing the great work, and really listening to the voice of the citizens too.
Don, as the economist, is there an opportunity to now, we're building at the high end, but how do you get it so that you build in the middle and sort of have it work its way down? Is there an option there? And is it in rehab? Is it new homes? What do you think can happen?
You hit about increasing construction costs of housing units. And maybe we need to think about providing incentives to build lower cost housing. For example, maybe we need to somehow give rental housing, or at least rental housing that serves a lower income clientele, a property tax break, right? So maybe they should benefit the same way owner-occupied homes do, maybe even more than that. Maybe you just cut their property tax bill in half for rental units that are rented with a large quantity, large proportion of housing that's lower income. I work with the MEDC, and we're very creative in the incentive plans we give out to companies to move to Michigan. A lot of that's appropriate. Maybe we should try some of those same sort of creative approaches to the construction of lower income housing. For example, we could stop imposing a sales tax on building materials for housing of lower income, lower cost housing units. So we need to be a little bit more creative in our public policy to try to get lower cost housing. And the other thing is we need more construction workers because we can't get anything built. And it tends to pay a pretty good wage. So try to be a little more constructive, a little more innovative. And particularly for governments, they're going to have to give up some of the revenue that they collect from rental housing, particularly lower income rental housing. So those are sort of some.
Any other thoughts, Bob, Bryan?
Hey, I say amen to Don. I think it's not going to happen without that happening. And our market's dysfunctional. I represent a group of some 5,000 builders and contractors doing business in the residential space. I would say probably 80-20 Republican, conservative to Democrats. So obviously dominated by that more conservative view. And if you have a bunch of Republican conservative builders and developers saying the market's dysfunctional and the government needs to insert itself into that marketplace, I would say the government needs to assert itself into that marketplace. And because the dysfunction is not going to end for communities that aren't willing to use the types of tools that the MEDC and others have created. And actually, some of those tools are already being used. And I've seen tax increment financing be used to help pay for infrastructure for developments. And in exchange, the builder is willing to sell below certain price points, below market. And I mean, those sorts of things have to happen or we're not going to address the problem.
Is the government up to this? In other words, do they understand the problem and are they capable of coming in and providing the leadership, obviously, that is being asked for here?
So I think that's a loaded question to critique our current elected officials or not, and I'm going to pass on that one. But what I would say is, I'm in rooms where the conversation of tax incremental financing or pilots come about, and there's really strong emotions and mixed emotions on both sides. So instead of getting into that debate, I'm going to stay on the sidelines. But what I would say is, one, there's a lot the government is doing, right? And there's a lot of different services, so it's not just affordable housing, which makes it so much harder. But there are examples of things that we can look at to say, would this work in Pontiac, for example? So one example is in Detroit, Sonia Mays, who is the executive director of a nonprofit called Develop Detroit, she used new market tax credits to actually build housing, market rate housing, 20% affordable, And the whole thing is normally new market tax credits do not go towards housing options. But what she created was a workforce development skilled trade company that the widget they produced was skilled labor. It filled the shortage, and what that did for like a $10 million development, it brought between 20 to 30% of new equity you never pay back. 20 to 30% or $2 to $3 million of subsidy to going into the housing to keep the housing price down. Right? Again, we don't want housing options of just concrete projects of affordable housing that really all we're doing is say, okay, all poor people live there. Even as a human being, that doesn't sound right. Right? We need mixed income. We need diverse communities. Right? That's when we're at our best. And so there are tools like that where we have to get creative. And I think the challenge is we take this one pill and it lowers our cholesterol, for example. It's not that easy. Right? It's a mix of a lot of different strategies, and it's alignment of us coming together.
Right, and so in the end, it is a situation where trying to find market normalcy is a team effort then, apparently.
Yeah, and I'm not afraid to tackle the question on our elected leaders. I do actually see bipartisan support and a belief and a recognition that more needs to be done. So I think, and I also see more and more local governments and communities recognize that the old adversarial relationship they used to have with builders and developers needs to end in order for them to attract that investment, and to look at that community as partners, not as an adversary, to see what we could squeeze out of them. And so we see some great, actually, to your point, I mean, Robertson Brothers is a great builder developer here in Southeast Michigan. I know they just did a deal down in Ann Arbor that includes a mix of larger, higher-end single-family homes, townhomes, more affordable, and then also rental units. So as part of the development agreement that they reached with the city of Ann Arbor, you know, they are actually addressing the issue that you raise of let's not have the super high end over here and keep the low end housing over here. It's really a strategy to mix the two, and I think more and more of that is happening and will continue to happen. The question is, will it happen on a statewide basis? I think we got many communities who still have that NIMBYism, the not in my backyard situation. Over on the west side, there was a bedroom community out of Grand Rapids where a development was approved for missing middle housing. We're talking like $250,000, maybe up to $300,000 single-family homes, all approved by the city council. And the NIMBY train came in. A bunch of neighborhood folks got the issue put on a ballot, and through the election process, they rejected that development after all the work had gone into developing it. So you have situations like that. So it's really education and awareness building. These types of opportunities is really important to educate communities and say, look, if you want your community to be around and you want young people to move into your community long term, you need to develop these strategies. It's not just, you know, the fear of bringing your home value down, which is often the case. It's, you know, if your community has no young people living in it in 20, 30 years, what does that do to your house value? So anyway.
Don, as the economist, you know, we're looking at, you know, we're, 12, 13 years past the last disaster that we had. How long is it going to take to get this thing to equalize? And does it? Okay. I don't hear very well. Okay, no, I'm asking, knowing all of this and knowing that it's been 12 years since the bubble burst the last time, can you project how long it's going to take for us to get out of this problem?
None of us will see us get out of that. Whatever it takes, it's going to be, it's really hard. You're talking large scale. There's actually another crisis which I think may be budding, and that's with transportation costs, particularly used motor vehicles. The inflation in the used motor vehicles the last couple of years has exploded. I do a lot of work with the auto industry, and even though they've come down a little bit, people are telling me that used cars are going to remain, prices are going to remain elevated for the foreseeable future, which when you think about most of the lower income households in Michigan and around the country, you know, they're not going to be able to afford to buy a used car, And without a used car, how are they going to get to work? And everybody says, well, mass transit, but mass transit doesn't work for a lot of households. So, the Pontiac Public Housing Commission, they may have to change their name and not only deal with need for affordable housing, but affordable transportation, which is going to emerge, I suspect, over the next couple of years as really a problem for lower income households as well. I mean, the problem for lower income households in Oakland County, even though it's a very affluent county in the state of Michigan, is I fear only going to get worse over the next few years. So sorry, I don't see it.
No, thank you for keeping me up late at night now. Does anybody have a question out in the audience here? Please, go right to the microphone.
My name's Elizabeth Kelly. I'm the retired CEO of Hope, which is a shelter here in Pontiac, and I'm still involved in advocacy with housing. Some of what you've talked about, but kind of like more in an economic sense, is about public policy. And public policy, especially when it comes to things like zoning, has been created in order to keep people of color, people who are living in poverty, sort of corralled in certain areas. And that's something that absolutely has to change. And so that would be one of the questions that I would ask about that. The other is a public policy around source of income. So landlords can legally discriminate against people who receive housing subsidies. But it also can include things like alimony or child support or Social Security income. And landlords can say you must earn 3 times the amount of the rent in a month, and that is still legal in Michigan. So I just would be curious about your thoughts around how public policy may need to change. The Grand Rapids example is really good. When you get people who are used to a certain way and you're making them change, that becomes a problem. So your thoughts on this? Just a little easy question, sorry.
So taking the first stab on this, and I am not an economist and I don't work in public policy, but when we look at some of the challenges and we look at the economy and like, when will we come back? Right, we were a state, we were a region that with a GED, we could work at GM, Chrysler, whoever, and make $100,000 plus a year doing a skilled labor. And we had that for decades and decades and decades, and it went away. And if we even look at the housing stock with Michigan's boom, Detroit's boom way back when, this was temporary housing that wasn't meant to be permanent housing. So the quality of the construction, the quality of the insulation, weatherization, all of these things, these were supposed to be temporary torn down. And for many, these are people's permanent housing that the only reason they have it is they passed it from generation to generation to generation. And a lot of this gets to systemic racism. I mean, I think we have to be very blunt and call it what it is. And how do we address that and how do we change that policy? How do we do work that really gives equal and equitable opportunity? And I think a lot of it is, and again, when I say it's not all about affordable housing, is we have to raise the economic power, or earning power of all of our populations, including our most vulnerable population. To have it where Pontiac's average household income is about $36,000 and the state is $89,000, right? There's also a cultural thing we have to worry about, changing this idea that it can be different for me. If I've grown up in poverty for decade after decade after decade, and I was born by a 16-year-old mom in River Rouge, and so I grew that childhood, and it was a stepdad that changed my trajectory, my life for the good. But many of us don't have that opportunity that stepped in. So how do we create this? And I think we have to be very intentional at the localized level, and we have to push at the state level and even federal level to have policy, addressing with the benefit cliff for welfare benefits, right? How do we give people opportunities where they can really take a stepping stone to improve their opportunity? How do we, through like the Pontiac Funder Collaborative and Oakland University and the Committee of 50 with Pastor Jones, and if I miss somebody, I apologize, but how do we create opportunities where it truly allows somebody a workforce development where they can change their earning power trajectory and give them wraparound services to help? there's a lot of things like in purpose-built communities, if you ever looked at it, where they say, let's give almost, for lack of better words, bubble wrap around somebody in their situation for about 6 years. And more than not, they're breaking the cycle of poverty for the rest of their lives. It's a lot of subsidy in the front end, but it changes it. And quite frankly, it's the right thing to do for humanity, but also it saves taxpayers long run. There are things like social impact bonds too that if we have time, we can talk about, but.
Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many policy questions wrapped in your comments that need to be addressed. And certainly you started with the big one with regard to zoning and density types of restrictions, 10-acre minimum lot sizes in areas. And particularly one of the things we've pushed for, and going back to the MEDC, actually trying to communicate with them and saying, look, if you're awarding a $100 million subsidy to an area of the state to attract the next battery plant or whatever, and you're awarding that in an area that has housing policies that have the 10-acre minimum types of things and have other policies that are really saying, hey, we want the jobs, but we don't want the workforce living in our community. Don't give that area, rule that community out from that type of assistance. Let's align our policies on economic development with housing availability. So number one. In terms of other issues, I will say, and on that issue, actually there's, in the legislature's going through a budget process right now. We've been part of a Housing Michigan Coalition. If you Google that, it's a kind of an interesting mix of groups. It's got people like the Home Builders Association, the Realtors. It's got people like the Michigan Municipal League, lots of nonprofit housing groups. We're all pushing for a number of different policy changes. So if you want to get active and support in Lansing, at least statewide policy, I encourage you to maybe become part of that Housing Michigan Coalition. And really, I think the concern also, we need to look at some of our long-standing programs that have helped people that really in this dysfunctional marketplace aren't helping people. I mean, if you're competing and need to use down payment assistance program or a VA loan or whatever it is, you're with all the cash deals available that are out there, realtors they have an obligation to present to the seller the best deals that they think make sense. And if you present several offers and 5 of them are needing some sort of assistance to make that deal happen, and you've got 1 or 2 cash deals and may even be at a lower price, oftentimes those cash deals go through first, and you're left out because you need that extra time for the extras, inspections, and other things that go along with those other government programs. So I actually think we need to flip some of those programs on their head, and we actually need to maybe look at incentives for sellers to sell to first-time home buyers and provide them some incentives, so because they're going to give up their 3% mortgage and have to jump to a 5 or 6% mortgage. So we need to think differently on a multitude of levels to really address things. But I appreciate your question. There's just so much that we need to do, and it's just one step at a time. And that's why I agree with Don. I think we won't be here any longer by the time this is solved, but we got to work at it nonetheless.
That's right. That's right. I do have one follow-up question based on what you were just mentioning. What we've noticed in the housing space, and especially in low-income housing, is that often these are owned by absentee landlords that are headquartered out of state, venture capitalist groups and things like this, which are not invested in the local communities. Any thoughts about how we might be able to either engage them better or figure out another way to sort of help people understand why it's important for the community to also embrace that rental space?
No. First, I would love it if it only cost us $100 million to attract a battery plant. Incentives are much more. But going back to your first comment about zoning, and I was sitting here thinking, it's like, what if we were zoning excluding people from certain areas based on their race, their skin color? I mean, it's not only illegal, but it is outrageous to even think that that would be a situation in 21st century America. Yet we can do it based on class and income today. And so maybe we need to begin to view integration not just on racial grounds, but on income grounds, and maybe bring the same sort of shame and legal pressure to places that want to zone now, exclusive zoning, in the same way that we applied to race. And then I forgot the rest of your question.
So Elizabeth, on the absentee owners, right? We've seen a number of municipalities, and I think this is where elected officials can really come in, but taking a really strong stance on nuisance and blighting, right? Where they're actually finding these absentee owners, because you're correct. I mean, for example, next to Little Caesars Arena, there's a gentleman out in London that bought a building from the land bank for $500. He has a price tag on it for $3 million. It might be worth $1,100. It's a teardown. But he said, wait a minute, a really rich family built this big stadium. Some developer will come in and buy it from me. That does not help economic community development. That does not help preserve affordability, right? So we're combating against that, and the person's just sitting there on the property. So, for example, I've been talking to a nonprofit the other day. They're trying to redo a theater, and it's a double-edged sword, because sometimes if there's not appraised values or there's gap subsidy, it takes time to make these projects happen. But we have a nonprofit partner in Detroit that $250,000 a month, because of the size of the building and water runoff, is the fines because this building is sitting vacant. So the nonprofit took it from the city to do a favor to try to revitalize it, but the gap is too big, so they gave it back to the city. So we have to be careful, right, what we ask for, because sometimes every action has a reaction. But I think we can take a strong policy against those who are absentee owners that are just letting their property neglect, and frankly, they're becoming slumlords, right? And so we have to think about how do we preserve quality and demand better in our neighborhoods.
I'm going to jump the line. I don't mean to do this, but Don, I continue to think about the current situation, and you discussed the transportation and the housing being intertwined. At 5.5% CPI, which is where we are right about now, and the demand for electric vehicles by 2030, it's only going to make matters worse. So how do we go about changing that, or do we? How do we get awareness of that as the problem? In other words, the people who are at the lower income end are the ones that suffer the most in high inflationary times.
You know, again, I think the first question when I was invited to speak here, and it's like I sat there and I thought about, well, what could we do? Well, first answer would be we would try to raise people's income. And I thought, okay, that's a solution to unaffordable housing. And the more I thought about it, then it's like, well, what happens if everybody's income goes up? If everybody's income goes up, then the price of housing is going to go up. You know, and so you can't raise everybody's income, especially you might be able to target certain income benefits to lower income, raise their income. But if it just an overall increase in wages, and it doesn't do you any good, because in fact, actually, I could design, I don't have to design it, I could easily try to explain a scenario where if you raise everybody's income by the same proportion, it actually makes it harder on low-income households, because usually the low-income households only have one earner, either as a single individual themselves or a single parent. And if you raise everybody's income, you get to two-earner households, who tend to be the most affluent there, they get twice as much of an income increase, and it makes the problem worse. So I think we have to be really creative in focusing on the problem, and not just take this.
Right. The laws of economics remain, like it or not.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, ma'am, go ahead.
All right, good morning. My name is Lauren Polk. I am a real estate investor transitioning into a developer. And so a lot of the situations that I'm seeing are the same for myself, who are the doctorate level educator, right? And someone who is purchasing property that I'm renovating. And that is the disparities within the credit rating system when you're talking income to debt ratio. So although you may have the capital, a lot of times, and this may be for you, Bryan, being in the banking industry, a lot of times we are faced with the disparities within the banking institution to receive the necessary financing. So I am forced to allow these individuals to purchase on a land contract basis versus a traditional basis. So what is being done when you're talking about revamping the credit rating system, which is very archaic and very outdated? So, I mean, those are the things that I see within the industry that are holding a lot of people back from transitioning to developing because we can't get the necessary financing. And also into home ownership, when you're talking the lower income, they may have 3 and 4 jobs, but then they have these other mechanisms that are forced to have their credit rating be non-competing when it's come to getting traditional finance.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a couple of things. When we think about this space, right after the race riots in 1977, so a little bit after the race riots, a little bit like a decade, we passed in our country the Community Reinvestment Act. And what this says is banks have an obligation to meet the needs of all community from a financial perspective, credit perspective, right? But that said, historically speaking, if you had a satisfactory rating, the advocacy groups, the regulators left you alone. To look at this difference, since I also teach at some colleges, if you're a C student and you're a heart surgeon, you still graduate and you can do heart surgery. I don't want to go to the C student for heart surgery, right? If I have to have one. So one, some banks take this to the next level. So I'm proud to say, and this is what got me from a CDFI back to a bank, PNC and Citibank are the only two in the top 10 in the country that have had an outstanding CR rating since 1977 when it passed. But even there, and to get more to your question, there's been a lot of studies that show that you can have an outstanding rating, so you can be that 4.0 college student for 40 plus years and still discriminate in your practices, right? So a couple of things is post-George Floyd, and one of the things, if I can boldly say it this way, a positive post-George Floyd is more than ever in the corporate boardrooms. We've talked about social justice and racial equity to a level I've never seen in my career, right? The depth of the conversation, what we do. So at PNC, we launched an $88 billion commitment for 4 years. We're about 18 months in. We've already met our halfway marker. So we've already deployed just about $45 billion as a country. So we're going to well exceed our goal. That said, we have some headwinds now. The interest rates a year ago were a lot less expensive than they are today, right? So that does slow down development and people wanting to borrow and buying a house, et cetera. But in that space, 2 things, and Roz's picture's up there. We launched a minority business banking practice. And inside of there, even elements of, on our pnc.com, we have a free site where you can go to, and it's targeted towards minority entrepreneurs to say, what is a business plan? How do I calculate my break-even analysis? What does the bank look at when they're looking at my credit for a small business? So for example, I just got a new mortgage about 2 years ago, and I work in the bank. I know the ratios. I know my ratios. And I still was like, how are they judging me? What are they looking at? Now, if I don't think the bank is for me or people like me, that's even scarier and more intimidating. So we're trying to make that as a tool and a resource where, one, they can educate themselves a little bit better if they want to, or they can meet with our people. Now, on the residential lending side, right, if we pick on residential mortgage lenders, and this is stereotyping across the industry, they get paid commission. So quite frankly, they would rather do a mortgage for our regional president, which definitely is not on a livable wage job, higher income, and is not buying his or her first house, right? And probably a higher income house, and everything is nice and easy, and maybe even a higher credit score. And so what we did is we hired what we call emerging residential mortgage lenders. They no longer have a dollar amount goal in the industry, right? Because what was happening is people, when someone said, I want a $30,000 mortgage, they were talking down to the person, or they weren't giving them the same respect as the person getting the $700,000 mortgage, because they weren't making the same commission. And why are you asking me these questions? You should know this already. They weren't given the same level of respect and dignity that they deserved. So now our residential mortgage lenders, if you will, right, they have a unit goal. And 80% of their business has to be in an LMI, low to moderate income census tract. They have to be, that's how they're judged. And they're expected to give the same quality of service as everyone else across our industry. And so we're continuing to improve access that way. Now the flip side on the credit score, that's an interesting one. 2 things, a lot of our housing advocacy groups will say to us, don't lower your credit scores. And they say that because, one, if someone has a bad habit or a bad pattern or bad at budgeting money, they might just repeat that mistake. We get them in a house and they lose it because of poor financial decisions. So many of them are saying, give us grant dollars to help educate them better. And we have lowered our credit scores a little bit, but at the same time we're doing that. Now where we're making it, we're trying to be more equitable in this to address challenges in systemic racism, is we have discounted interest rates if it's in an LMI census tract and if it's a black or brown borrower, right? Because we know from a historical lens, there's been higher cost of capital for those borrowing for our minority population. So we're trying to do solutions to help address that, but it's not obviously a 100% fix.
Okay, one last question.
that gentleman was next.
Guys, I didn't see. Go ahead, sir.
Sure. I just had a couple quick follow-ups, and bringing the conversation sort of hyper locally. I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about the trends in homeownership versus rental, that in Pontiac it's essentially reverse, right? So it's well over half of our residents are renters here. I think it's also important to talk about that when we're talking about not wanting to create geographic inequities and density of low-income populations, which I agree with, that doesn't get misinterpreted as development of quote-unquote low-income housing in low-income communities is an economic negative for those communities. The data shows that low-income housing tax credit developments, by and large, increase surrounding property values in communities where it's very difficult to make deals work without those subsidies. And also most of the population in Pontiac with $30-something thousand average household income already qualifies. So it's not like we're lowering the value there. What we're doing is we're actually investing a bunch of resources in higher quality rental housing, which shifts the market. It increases surrounding property values, which makes it more viable to actually develop homeownership opportunities because homes actually start appraising. And it also pushes landlords who are currently providing naturally affordable housing to actually increase their quality as well because they have to compete with those units. So while I agree 100% and I'm very focused at Lighthouse on developing affordable housing opportunities in higher income communities, I want to make sure that we also recognize the value of those tools here locally in Pontiac. And so it's just, and also, Bryan, you are a great example of somebody who had opportunities to increase your financial wherewithal. And you said you grew up in River Rouge. I assume you no longer live in River Rouge, right? So I think one of the things that we have to really also be thinking about in Pontiac is what are we doing for people who don't have those opportunities? When we invest in people who have those opportunities, they leave. And so I think geographically at Pontiac, we really have to be thinking about that long game that our economy is going to continue to need. I think it was Don's comment that if we increase everybody's income, there's still going to be inequality unless we completely revamp our economic structure, because every time we increase high income jobs locally, we're also increasing the need for lower to mid income jobs locally, and so we're left with the same problem. Is essentially what I would share. If anyone has any thoughts on that might change my thinking, that'd be wonderful.
My only comment is housing attainability, the words we use from a policy-making standpoint, and the whole NIMBY issue, we've really tried to concentrate on attainability and talking with policy leaders to use that kind of terminology, because affordable housing has a historic connotation that some people view negatively from that NIMBY standpoint. So I think the words we're using and the language we use as we're talking about these projects are really, really important. That's just as I heard you talk. I agree 100% with what you were saying. When the term affordable housing, though, I think is something we need to rethink in terms of how we articulate it.
Well, I would even say affordable would be an improvement, because the name of the program that funds the vast majority of our affordable housing units is actually low income, right? Which is, I think, stigmatized even further than affordable. And I don't know, is anybody working on changing that anyone's aware of? Because I've almost everybody in our space has been complaining about it for as long as I've been in this work, but we still call it low-income housing tax credit.
Don, we only got a couple of minutes left, so Don, go ahead. One last thought there.
Yeah, going back to where sometimes government policies sort of screw things up. After the financial crisis in 2007, 8, and 9, the government really tightened up mortgage lending standards to a tremendous extent, imposing very tight standards on banks and other lenders. And so, for example, they sort of lost their flexibility to go in and make loans based upon their judgment calls. They have to meet all of these qualifications, which is maybe saves the economy some of the risks involved, but it has made a lot harder for lower income people who are sort of out of the mainstream paycheck from a regular employer to get mortgage loans and other loans as well. And so maybe we need to ease up on some of those regulations.
Well, and yeah, regulation is often a blunt instrument instead of something nuanced. One last question, sir.
Okay, let's go right to the source of the money. That's employers. One of the proudest moments of my life is when all 20 of my employees were working towards buying their own house, and it was my company that was paying their mortgage, essentially. With that being said, a negative thing happened is when I asked my employees to start investing in a 401k plan, and they had to make a choice between the money going towards their mortgage or going towards their 401k plan. Policy, Don, can we get a policy that says that employers and employees can invest in a mortgage with pre-tax dollars and have that get incentivized in a similar manner that we do the 401k plan?
I like it.
Good idea. Nicely done. All right, well, gentlemen, thank you very much. This was most enlightening, most informative, and I'm greatly appreciative of your efforts here today. Thank you. Let's have a hand for everybody.